Good afternoon, good morning, buon pomeriggio, buongiorno. Welcome again to our book presentation. I'm here in Pordenone live. On my back, you can see the beautiful square of Pordenone just in front of the theater where our festival takes place. As I said, welcome again to our first session of book presentation that come again in this giornate, 40th year giornate. Today we'll be talking about very interesting books, sometimes can be felt like a little bit different in some position, but they're not, because the essence is always very close to them. The first one we will be introducing today is Struggle for Recognition, Melodrama and Visibility in Latin American Silent Film. Here you can see the book. And to talk about it, we have the author, Juan Sebastian Ospina Leon from Boston. Thank you, Juan Sebastian. Welcome.
Ciao, Paolo. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We are particularly happy of all the books, of course, all the presentation we do. It makes me particularly happy to have this book because not only the topic is interesting, and it's, of course, your point of view, which is very academic in a good sense, I would say, so very well structured, which is what we prefer and like. And it's first of all, it's a broad view on silent cinema in Latin America, of which you pick some movies, and we might be talking about it a little bit, but with a very specific point of view. So, Juan Sebastian, can you introduce us a little bit the book, the idea behind it, of course, and how do you choose materials to work with?
Thank you, Paolo. So, as you're proposing and as you're saying, the book indeed wanted to aim for the broadest spectrum possible of different examples of melodramatic film in Latin America in the first decades of the 20th century. And what I aimed to do was to try to break with two things first. One was to break with the sense that all historiographical studies of silent cinema in Latin America have to be national. No, they have to be centered on a specific country. I wanted to break with those boundaries. And also, I wanted to reconsider what does being modern mean in Latin America. So the book does not look at films from different countries. It looks at films that were produced in different cities and how those stories, as you mentioned, these melodramas, in many ways try to make sense of all of the changes that were happening in all these different cities across the continent.
Yeah, that's the, as I was mentioning before, the very interesting point of view is exactly like that. There's been, again, maybe not enough publication on silent film in Latin America, and yet, yes, they're very national. There is not yet a broader spectrum, as there is in Europe, but there has been. But your point of view is particularly interesting because modernity, what is modern, coming, we have a perspective from I would say from Europe, from of course North America, and so. But what it means in Latin America, it is different because, as many things, has been interpreted in a different ways and with different examples. If we, for example, start looking at Colombia, and particularly Garras de Oro, one of the book you talk mainly, there is a particular point of view which also involves heavily politics, but a more general, beyond national, I would say, discourse, and the connection of that with modernity in many essence.
That is very true, Paolo. This film is a fascinating film because, as you're suggesting, it's a movie. Here in this clip, we can see an allegorical representation. This brackets the film at the end and the beginning of the movie, where you see this Uncle Sam, who is a monster. As you can see, he has talons, right? Like a bird of prey. And he's putting there bags of gold to try to compensate for the fact that Colombia lost the Panama Isthmus because of American intervention. And as you can see, justice does not change the weights as Uncle Sam gets more and more upset that he cannot impose his justice on the Colombian territory. So this film very explicitly critiques this big stick diplomacy of the United States on many countries in Latin America. And as you're pointing, one of the elements that I studied the most in this film, it's the fact that the different consular offices in Colombia and in different countries across the Caribbean were exchanging letters and telegrams and different forms of communication to try to prevent the film from being released.
Yeah.
To the point that even in Colombia, they were able to propose a policy that any projectionist that would show this film would be incarcerated. I did not find in the archives any projectionist in jail because of showing this movie, but the document did show this intention.
So there was what we will call now, with a very abused word, of course, a global view and a global intention. And very early, of course, U.S. politics of the 20, very early interference, not only in Colombia and Latin America, that can be discussed in many ways. And that's why there is a lot to be saying about that. Now, keep on in the Colombian perspective, something that also you mentioned in your book. It's the interesting, and there is a photo of that, the interesting representation and how was perpetrated the image of Catholicism and connected, of course, to morality, which is a main point that we will keep on discussing also in the other books. Because the way morality is described, particularly in movies, is kind of double-faced, with the exception of Colombia, in which the way it is described is different. And in fact, there is a nice photo of a Christ image that you sent us as well.
Indeed. At least here in the United States, one of the elements that critics praise the most of the book is the fact that I read the theory of modernity in Latin America and the theory of melodrama in general, taking into account this element of the religious, both in melodrama. We in academia, it is thought that melodrama springs from the French Revolution, right? From the break of these institutions such as the king and the church, and the lack of sense in everyday life that rupture produces. And in modernity, also the break, the secularization of states is a given in the processes of modernization in Latin America. Colombian films and the Colombian zeitgeist, I would say, at the moment, show the opposite. It shows a country that instead of becoming more secular to become more modern, it was a country that was becoming more and more religious as a sign of modernity. So, for instance, this film that I analyze in the book, that is called Under the Antioquia Sky, Antioquia is a region in Colombia, is a film that shows almost like topicals, all these images of industry, production, plantations, coffee plantations. And at the same time, the elements that push the story forward, as you mentioned, is a Christian morality, and Catholic imagery. So as you're saying, we see all these images of Jesus Christ with the crown of thorns, and there's Iris Enaus that compare the main character of the film with the Christ. We see also the female lead clinging to this enormous cross in Medellin's main cemetery, and all these different images that are associating progress, technology, and the elite with Catholic morals.
Absolutely. So, because of the time, we could be just talking about Colombia, but it would be a shame, because it's such a complete book, in my opinion, that we will have to jump and move a little bit to Mexico, which I feel a little bit even more comfortable about. And as we were talking also before, in Mexico, with Mexican silent cinema, despite the fact that as in every country, we lost so much, we're lucky enough that the few films that survive actually are available. So one, actually, you consider two, and it is very interesting because they describe two different completely idea. especially El Puño de Hierro, which we'll be back to it. But El Tren Fantasma also, it is something that if we talk about modernity, it makes sense. But it's interesting because it is connected to Orizaba, which is not Mexico City, of course. So not the center of what we expect, the center of modernity still today, the giant, the monster, as we call it, but rather what we could consider peripheral. But it's not the case of Orizaba, and particularly of El Tren Fantasma.
Orizaba is a very special city in Mexico at the time because Orizaba is located right in the center between Mexico City and Veracruz, which is Mexico's most important port. So Orizaba was this sort of a bridge between the two cities, and it had a thriving textile industry at the time. It was waning, however, and these two films that Paolo, that you're mentioning, particularly Tren Fantasma, are trying to, on the contrary, show or are trying to boast, let's say, Orizaba's modernity. So, for instance, El Tren Fantasma does this with images of the train, right? Like this I don't know, almost like
multiple images of the train. There's multiple trains.
Oh, yes, you're right. So there's steam trains, there's electric trains, and these are signs of modernity. And at the same time, and something that I, for instance, if we look at those images right there, something that I highlight a lot is the question of fashion in the film, because we see, look at, for instance, like the woman there, you see that the almost like a Mexican flapper appears in these films, and both female characters are always wearing the latest fashion. They're wearing these, close hats with embroidered elements, and all of these come together in this action-packed film as a sign of modernity. It reminds me a lot, for instance, of films or series such as The Perils of Pauline, for instance, The Hazards of Helen. And indeed, because of the proximity with the US, and also because of the how popular serials were, I know myself that in Pordenone, some of the films that I enjoy the most is watching the serials. They also, this type of action melodrama lends itself to give a very sense of the modern. They're very fast-paced, they're quick, they're exciting, and that's what this film was trying to reproduce.
Yes, as we said, it is unfortunately very hard to have even a glimpse to the full production of all the countries in Latin America. But yet, it is striking, or we are lucky to have movies that are very, very complex in many aspects and ways. That what you were saying is exactly, there is so many elements just in the Tren Fantasma that are connected to modernity, but that goes also beyond, because what you were mentioning about the pace is particularly interesting, because it's a clear sign of original production, first of all, and screenplays. And they're both the pace and the way they look and the construction of the imagery are very, very contemporary, what we can call contemporary of the time in the rest of the world. Meaning they are not, is not something coming from abroad or it is copied from abroad. It's just something that just has its own ways of describing what's happening in the society. And how we can read it now, it's how we interpret what was happening back there. For sure, back in the days, it was clear they were not necessarily bringing only innovation, as you were mentioning for Izaba particularly, but they were describing what was happening. So it is more complex, and that's what we always say about silent movies in general. You don't only watching a movie or a story. There's way more beyond that goes beyond the eyes. And speaking of that, El Puño de Hierro is definitely something completely different from every single movies, with maybe some exception that you can ever seen. We have screened El Tren Fantasma. We haven't screened El Puño, I think, yet here in Pordenone, but I hope one day we will, because it is it has so many things inside, and is difficult to understand because we are out of the time. So Many aspects could be done, but just the dichotomy, I will say, of drugs and public health make it fascinating, I would say.
That film is a beast in itself, I would say. One of the elements that I explore the most in the film is how, since it has been, let's say, it is the product of multiple reconstruction attempts and re-editing attempts. I think this movie has so many potentials for interpretation. So, as you're pointing out, this this dialogue between drug use, drug abuse, no, opium is the like the center of the story, and public health is indeed the most important theme in this film. What is most interesting, and I hope I don't discourage anyone by telling this, but there's many there's a series of doppelgangers in the film. No, there's many people that are two people at the same time, and this ultimately, or in my analysis, aims at making a very strong critique at the Mexican national health policies of the time. Because, spoiler alert, the doctor that is deploying this health, let's say like this health project in the story, ends up being one of the most vicious drug pushers in the film. So there is a very strong sense of critique there. But at the same time, and something that I add to my analysis at the end as an open-ended question, is are we actually watching the film as it was made back in the day? Because in the reconstruction, Esperanza Vasquez, who is the one, and that you know, Paolo, who was leading the reconstruction of this film, she adds some intertitles at the end saying, you know, this is the end of the film. And then there's this little end where a boy scares the main characters. But that boy at the end of the film is wearing like this robe that only takes place in some of the hallucinations that the main character has when he is, you know, high on opium. So I asked myself, with these elements of the doppelganger, these elements of the dream, these elements of what is reality and what is not, and this element from the dream that appears in reality at the end, is this a matter of the reconstruction, or is this film hinting at different elements of the fantastic as a narrative strategy for making a social critique? And I think if you look at these elements closely, I think you could make a very good case that this film is not only very complex in its story and its critique of some social events, but also very complex in the way that it appropriates different narrative strategies or narrative tropes.
Absolutely. And that's was always striking me of, in general, silent, of course, after silent, Latin American cinema has given so much and yet not fully recognized, I would say. I'm talking about the Mexican cinema that I know. Some are very known, a lot are still not known enough. But when we go to silent, I must say that it's only thanks to yes, of course, Esperanza Vasquez, but also Aurelio de los Reyes and many others, which it will be a very long list, and archives that preserve, but only make it, when possible, accessible with many different versions, because technology advanced and allowed us to go back and reconsider the movies, which is exactly what happened here at the Giornata as well. Every 10 years, we might rewatch a movie, and if we rescreen a movie at the Giornata, is because something has completely changed and happened very much. And as I was saying, that's why for me it's particularly striking and important, this book, because that kind of reflection, that I put myself in that bunch. People who make restoration, at least in Mexico, Latin America, shout, please watch the movie, tell us where we are wrong, because we don't know. We really don't. We do our best to be as close to what we think could be right, what the materials tell us, but everything can be a lie and everything can be spin in few words. And just as you were mentioning, it is very complicated to work with the intertitles. Most of the times there is no always clear reference where they go and where they're meant to be. So we do what could be the best. Just as we were talking, for example, today, the collegium, exactly about that. It is more important to have it out and hope the discussion will keep on. So, as I said, I really hope this book will travel more. I think it will, because there is more to say and more to be just watching the movies. That's what we are expecting, which also is happening, luckily. Somehow I feel also in Latin America, I feel in Mexico too, with all the problems that we still have, and so, but reflection and in this sense on silent cinemas in Latin America is still a way to go, but definitely the digital possibility can help us in that sense. Now, a last things before we see if there is another question, but we haven't talked about the Argentinian films, although you mentioned them, of course. Um, and that is particularly interested, even if it's very hard, because there's not so much we can focus on, because the case of Buenos Aires is particularly interest in many ways and many aspects. One really strike me that you consider that is particularly relevant, I would say, is the creation of the consumer culture. What kind of way of consumer culture we can see through these movies that again reflect what was happening in Buenos Aires, which was definitely a striving super international city in the 20s, as well, of course, as others in Latin America, but particularly, we'll say, Buenos Aires.
Buenos Aires is a city that is that is unique in the continent, I would say. When I was doing the research in Buenos Aires, I had the fortune of meeting Adrián Moyo, who is the director of the library at the ENERC, which is a very important film school in Buenos Aires. And at the time, or I guess always, he has been a fan of tango music. So each time that I would go to the archive, he would not only talk to me about tango, but about how tango tells the story of Buenos Aires, how it was a city that in the first years of the 20th century, it received a way bigger and more diverse influx of immigrants than even New York City, for instance. And these films that I studied, that back in the day, they were called cinedrama porteño, so like Buenos Aires cinedrama, are precisely telling that story, the story of immigration, the story of this enormous influx of bodies that enter in this free-for-all market where everything is up for grabs and everything is up for sale, for purchase, including the bodies themselves. Mm-hmm. So you see, it is very common when you listen tango music to have all these narratives of prostitutes and suffering men, right? Men that fall in love with these prostitutes, and how these women have this overpowering influence on men. But these films, I would say, present a more gender equality scenario, in the sense that you see both men and women being victims and perpetrators of this space of extreme exchange and velocity that is the city of Buenos Aires.
And going back to that, to what you were just saying, it is particularly striking in the movies set in Buenos Aires and Argentina. Also, the fact that the position on what was considered just even 10 years before, lost woman, and then we go back to the morality, of course. But what is their position in the society and in the movies, which is completely changed to what it was before. So the twist that cinema does on that, and the modernity that does, which is corresponded also in Europe and in North America, tell us how was the situation in Buenos Aires. And the fact also that you mentioned the immigration is very important, of course, because we know how that twisted and changed and make, as you said, Buenos Aires so unique, because a lot, also the filmmakers and in other parts of Latin America, but particularly in Buenos Aires, were immigrants, or some actors were immigrants, and therefore there was despite the distance, there was a very straight connection, particularly with Europe, in Buenos Aires, and that is reflected in cinemas, and therefore in the concept of modernity and of urban society, which was forming everywhere in the world in that time, and it is particularly in Buenos Aires, I would say.
Indeed, indeed. There's these films in many ways show these I would say two-way exchanges. No, as you're saying, this is not only a question of movements from Europe to the Americas in terms of film technology, film genres, and people, but also this communication can go in the opposite direction. No, not only through their narratives, not only through the stories in the movies, but also in the production of the films themselves. So, for instance, a very interesting example that I will just mention very briefly is an Argentinian film that is called A Glorious and New Nation, that was completely produced in Hollywood, but the script was made by a Argentinian tycoon. He put all of the money, and he created a film that it was kind of like a win and a flop, both in Argentina and in the United States, according to my research. But it shows a very interesting example of this direction of monies and stories and influences going into the opposite direction.
Absolutely. I think, yes, as you were saying, and you also mentioned this in the conclusion of your book, just to close our brief conversation, how there is even more and more to explore, of course, because there is also to consider the connection between specific country, in general, Latin America, and of course the US, but also Europe. And that kind of connection is being studied, as particularly recently, in the more recent film studies, but I would say, but I think you can agree with me, I hope, in silent cinemas is not that documented yet. For Mexico, it's even stronger because there was like a back and forth of actors, production, and so on. But this is for all Latin America, I would say. Well, please, Juan Sebastian, if you have a last comment or just a footnote. We could be talking endlessly, but we have to be strict. So let me know if you want to add something.
Oh, I don't have anything to add. If there's room for at least one question from the audience, I'll be very happy to answer. If not, I just want to say thank you, Paolo. To see you again makes me so happy.
Thank you so much, too. Sometimes our questions are a little bit slow, so maybe you will check our stream. This conversation will be streamed again on our YouTube channel. I'm sure there is more questions to come up. So thank you so much, Juan Sebastian Ospina, for your presence. And we move to another book that is particularly interesting, and as I was mentioning, different but interesting, Scratches and Glitches, and particularly observation in preserving and exhibit cinema in the early 20th century. The author is with us, Juri Meden. Thank you, Juri, for joining us from Vienna. Hi.
Hello. For having me.
That's so great. So as I was saying, today we are doing something different. As always, we are all mixing other things. We are mixing, but putting your books on the mix, it makes me, again, particularly happy because it is a book that is challenging in the good way, always in the good way. I think a challenge is always something interesting. So it is, as you mentioned since the beginning, these are all your private in a way, private thoughts, but very focused, of course, on specific topics, and private and personal, but they are kind of fermented to the years. And I'm using this word not because I think you talk about that in a way too. And is a way to not only, as we can say, just talk to yourself, but talk in general to what is a broader sense of our community, I would say, because there's many things in which we sometimes focus on particular aspect of preservation, of programming, authors, of course, movies, many ways we can look through things. But sometimes, which was kind of the same of our previous book, not a broader view. So an overview of some things that is definitely connected to us. in that sense, just to give an introduction to our to whoever will be watching our presentation, how this book came along, and I know the time also is particularly interesting in when you start thinking about it and how it evolved, and why you feel the need of be saying and making this book.
Well, first of all, Paolo, thank you very much for this very beautiful and I think also very accurate description of my book. I mean, yes, my observations, of course, are private. The book was, I've been writing these thoughts and observations for a long time, and I deliberately call them thoughts and observations because there are certain chapters in my book in which I actually develop a thought, and there are certain chapters where I merely observe something and then juxtapose it with another situation. Because, you know, to me in general in life, it's important to remain curious about things, and I must admit that I do not have the answer to many of the dilemmas I talk about in my book. I started thinking about connecting these essays that I've been writing into a book at the beginning of the first lockdown last year, when something very strange and interesting happened. Basically, a couple of days into the lockdown, several venues, several platforms, several places that used to be in the business, if I may use this word, of exhibiting cinema, have very quickly reinvented themselves as streaming services. Festivals all of a sudden started becoming online platforms. Art house cinemas, film museums, film archives that used to be, again, I use this word metaphorically, in the business of exhibiting cinema turned into streaming platforms. And this happened so quickly that I understood that this rupture that was caused by the virus that forced us all into the privacy of our homes wasn't really a rupture. It was just an acceleration of a certain trend that has existed in the world of cinema already for the past, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 years, ever since streaming became so dominant. And that made me aware that, and I was thinking from my own perspective as a curator, as a programmer of a film museum, that made me aware that we always talk about how we preserve cinema, how we preserve films, how we preserve these artifacts, how we preserve the original cinematographic experience, how we preserve this and that. I all of a sudden realized that it's perhaps more important to preserve audience and the idea of an event as opposed to cinema, because what good are all our efforts to preserve all these artifacts at cinema if we don't preserve this wonderful idea of coming together in a public space and watching something. What does this mean? This means 1,000 things. I'm talking about the size of the screen. I'm talking about the fact that you surrender your disbelief and that you turn off your phone and that you patiently observe the screen for 2 hours. I mean, that concept is almost radical today. I'm talking about the idea of sharing the same space with other beings, about the possibility of meeting strangers, exchanging ideas. And this to me all of a sudden appeared as something more important than preserving the actual cinema. And from this perspective, you know, if I further develop this thought, because this is how I started this book, I was just thinking aloud. I also must say that I find it really ridiculous that there's this competition happening out there right now with film festivals refusing to screen something on the big screen because it has already been streamed, which I think is complete nonsense. Yeah. It's like restaurants would be afraid of grocery stores and would say, we will no longer cook pasta or prepare espresso because you can buy it in a grocery store. I mean, it's something completely different to go to a restaurant and have a good meal or cooking this meal at home. So this was the beginning. And then I started writing, and within a year, basically, the book has assumed the shape that it has now.
So now, yes, just for something, for example, you're mentioning what is, let's say, an interesting, I would say, parallel between the kinetoscope and Netflix in that sense. So that's a very interesting parallel because it is something I think about it as well, and I try to describe it, not in the sense, but what it is, the private viewing, exactly what you were saying right now, what it was meant to. It's not that it's something it's not known in cinema, but of course it was completely different to what we are considering cinema in that sense. And what is Netflix with the good or the bad of whatever we can consider is something different. And the point of being different is not necessarily bad, but as you were saying exactly right now, it is our perspective that is different. So it is what we put in thinking, and that's the point that it's also, I think, sometimes not considered. It's like, make a restoration is great, preserving is great, but we have also to consider, okay, where is this gonna be seen and how, and what can we do about that, what can we say about that, because that's also make a difference, a huge difference on the final result. We can use the digital tools, which are great, which I personally love. We can use it, yes, absolutely. But then if you only see in the movie, again, keep on watching it in small screens, in a lab, or even in a theater, in a digital theater of the lab, fine, but that's not ultimately what we were trying to aim to go back to. And on that sense, you also broaden, of course, the discussion on and throw the rocks and pushing, which I like, the discussion on, of course, restoration and digital restoration. And more than trying to identify what it is, more thinking of what it meant, what is used right now, how is used right now, which is, and again, we were talking just today about it on the Collegium, the idea of pristine, of as seen as it was first screened, which makes really, really not our point in what should be preservation and then exhibiting preserved material. So, yeah, I don't know if you want to add something on that. I'm sure you do.
You opened up a large number of very interesting subjects. I'll maybe only comment on a couple of them. You began by referring to my chapter on the curve I described, going from kinetoscope to big screen to Netflix. The idea of this chapter was, when we talk about cinema, and by we, I mean the community, for example, is gathered here in Pordenone right now, we tend to operate with certain moral certainty. We attribute moral categories to certain things, and I'm not sure that this is the right thing. Like, for example, I love watching films on the big screen, but we tend to say that watching things on the big screen is the only proper way to see things. We say watching things on the big screen is the original way of exhibiting cinema. Well, it's not, because kinetoscope was private. You could see the film only for yourself. It was the idea of seeing moving images only for two eyes at the same time. And it would be good that we would remember that the idea of big screen was not some sort of an artistic invention of poets, of artists who believed that moving images will look so much more better, glorious on the big screen. Of course they do. It was an economic invention. Somebody has invented the big screen because he realized that he can sell the same stripe of paper or celluloid at the same time to 100 or 500 pairs of eyes as opposed to only one eye. So in a way, cinema, going back to our living rooms, is kind of like it's going back to where it started. And again, my point is not to say this is bad, this is good. My point is just to question our certainty in attributing this, in placing these things in moral categories. I ask myself the same question when I talk about the idea of memory in relation to history. We tend to think that we do what we do because it's important to remember. We say that it's important to remember, it's important not to forget. We preserve cinema because it's part of cultural heritage. Why attribute memory with this moral category of being good? What's wrong with forgetting? Like in several chapters of my book, I say that perhaps instead of actively preserving things, we should be actively forgetting things and erasing things, because we now live in an era in which moving images are multiplying with gigantic speed and occupying more and more of both our mental and physical space. So maybe it's time that we start actively destroying them and keeping only certain things that we are sure will help us, I don't know, envision a better future. Because why not today talk in these utilitarian terms? We know that we live in a world which is rapidly warming up, so it's also the responsibility of us, film curators, to think what we can do.
Let me add the note. Let me add the note of what you just said, because, and in general, to give a better sense of your book, for who hasn't read it yet, as we were saying, what you were also mentioning, that while writing the chapter, you yourself made an idea, and this is interesting because it's a small book with a lot of very punctual thoughts that can also take in parts, and each part can be discussed. So it's almost like, I feel, a mix. Let's say almost, and correct me if I'm wrong, a philosophy of the archive, not only the theorization of archiving and preserving, but philosophy in the sense of discussion, of open discussion, as in the Platonic way, if you want. So an open discussion that is, of course, in the form of a book, it's written, but there's thoughts. And as you said, of which you don't have answer to all of that, which of course is definitely part of our job. But just the idea of putting it in there and having a time will help whoever read it as well to make the same effort and make thinking about all this. And in that sense, you mentioned again with strong words, which I loved, like defining the film materials a dead organic material. It is great because it's exactly what it is, and we forgot about that. And what you were saying exactly right now on memory and connected to what will remain. And so it is particularly striking for the way you say it, definitely.
Yeah, Paolo, I mean, you are brilliant with your comments, because you have again opened up then areas. I wouldn't go so far to, I wouldn't dare to call my book philosophical book. But what I am doing in my book is, yes, I am trying to take not only one step back, but sometimes 3 or 30 steps back, and take a look at the history of cinema, the history of film exhibition and preservation in a wider optics of not only cultural history, but history in general. And of course, if you do that, you very soon come to certain unshakable realizations. For example, the idea of preserving something material in an immovable, pristine form is nonsense. We cannot do that. I mean, the only possible way to preserve anything is through constant change. I mean, we human beings have evolved through this process of evolution. What is evolution other than constant change? You mentioned before digital tools, restoration, the striving for this idea of a pristine image. I mean, history of cinema is not history of pristine images. History of cinema in 99% is history of scratches, of glitches, of dirt, of imperfect projections. You know, what does it mean when we say that we have preserved something, that we have offered a historical film to contemporary audience so that they can experience it the way people experienced it 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago? You know, like to properly experience a Chaplin film today, the way people experienced it in the 20s when it was made, we would have to probably first starve ourselves and then go to the cinema cold and wet and hungry, the way all those working masses did in the 20s. And then Chaplin would provide shelter for us. It would offer a safe space. It would give us, it would imbue us with this sense of belonging somewhere. It would provide a sense of utopia within our reach, which of course, you know, is all absent today when we sit in our warm clothes and watch Chaplin. We see the genius of Chaplin. We see the genius of his staging, editing. We hear the genius of him as a musician, but there is so much more to this idea of authentic cinematographic experience, where we should consider much more than just technology.
Absolutely, yeah. What you just said is very striking. Absolutely, it's like deciding now we can choose to go to the cinema, and our choice will not affect directly our day life, in the sense we choose to go, we choose not to go. It is fine. It's our choice. It's of course an effort, but as you said, yes. How can we understand the fact that choosing how much we will eat maybe in a day, and decided instead to go to the cinema to provide a different, let's say, need, it really changed the perspective of how we could see that movies and others movies, and that's why the broad variety of silent cinema too. It's definitely striking in that sense. um, we were talking about the material, the materialistic part of the cinema, and you made two examples that are very interesting, very interesting to me, which I didn't, of course, know. There is, first of all, the case of this artist who make a reduction of Last Tango, of the Last Tango by Bernardo Bertolucci, which I thought is especially the way you said it, you read it, it's particularly striking, to because it's the point of view of considering what is exactly the essence of cinema as art. Is it how many perspectives do we should have, and how is, as you were saying, evolving and changing in that sense? I don't know if you want to tell briefly that story, and of course, the Bite Me Once Already, if I'm not mistaken, which is a great story that you will pardon me, but I will use it definitely in my classes, because it is very on the point of what the film material is and how it's to be also lived.
So this particular story that you're mentioning was actually born out of my discussions with the head of our film collections in Vienna, Kevin Lutz, who is a brilliant film archivist and a very good friend of mine. He's often teasing me that I am programming films which look terrible. And we even had this discussion when he said that we should impose some sort of a visual standard and not show films which are in such a poor shape. And my response is, if you stick to film canon, if you want to make your film program only composed of great classics, if all you want to do is a John Ford retrospective followed by a Godard retrospective followed by a Griffith retrospective, then of course you will always have access to great 35mm film prints, to DCPs. But as soon as you go away from the canon, and really you don't have to go far, you stumble into a swamp of unpreserved films. I mean, I was reading this article about how much of cultural heritage has been digitized so far, and vast majority of everything that was written has been digitized already. We will never, of course, be able to digitize anything remotely close to majority of moving images, simply because it's way too expensive, and it relies way too much on the rules of the free market, and because simply so much has been lost. So in this particular case, I wanted to show a beautiful found footage film from Serbia called Last Tango in Paris, directed by a very talented, brilliant Serbian avant-garde filmmaker, Miodrag Misha Milosevic. It's a film that was made in the early 80s, and what he did was he took an 8mm camera and he recorded scenes of Last Tango in Paris from the television screen. Now, this particular way of shooting, acquiring found footage through television was actually a very common practice in Yugoslavia, where filmmakers were so poor they didn't have access to found footage. There was no trash can to go to. So they would create their own found footage by shooting television screens with 8mm cameras. So he created his own version, his own montage of Last Tango in Paris, which was about 10 minutes long, black and white, with, of course, grainy 8mm images, no sound. Then he blew it up to 16mm, in the process the original 8mm was lost, he created one 16mm positive print, which was then exhibited at several film festivals in Yugoslavia, also I think at some point in Paris in the mid-80s. Then in the late 80s, early 90s, this 16mm print was telecinet. The filmmaker himself took a Betacam and created a telecine version. Then the 16mm camera print was lost. Then that beta was lying dormant in some room in an archive in Belgrade for 20 years, and then he digitized it. So today the only thing that exists is this tiny, I don't know, 1.2 gigabyte large Matroska file, and the image has, of course, radically changed from what it was before. It became, there are new scratches and glitches, and there's a tint. It's impossible to describe how much it has changed. The filmmaker has inscribed this change into the very creation because he wanted to alter Bertolucci's original images. So he is happy today with this change. But my point is, if I want to show this, this is the only thing that survives. One could say, no, we need to find the original quality, the original 16mm. It's impossible. It's impossible. And to stay with the subject of Serbia, for example, we all know, and I'm not trying to make a political statement now, but we all know that in the late 90s, when NATO was bombing Serbia, they bombed television archives. The television archive of Belgrade television, of Novi Sad television was bombed. How many films were lost there? And this is something that we, perhaps as one of the concluding thoughts, we tend to forget because we have made the whole world aware of this very sad fact that 80 or 90% of silent cinema is lost irretrievably because the studio simply didn't bother with preserving it, and they realized that the importance of preservation very, very late after first film museums have appeared in the 30s. But when we say that, we often forget that perhaps an equal percentage of films from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s is lost. I was amused the other day, a couple of weeks ago, I saw an online ad. I saw that Netflix is hiring a preservation officer. Yes. Which means that they're finally thinking about creating a preservation department, which is wonderful because it's mimicking the way the old Hollywood studios behaved. It was only 20, 30 years after they were born that they started realizing, what, we should preserve films. So the history repeats itself in a funny way.
Yeah, I heard about that in Netflix too. I think they're going in another way. Which is mainly, to what I heard, they want to be working on the props more than on the actual movies, most likely because the movies, they think they are preserved. And then again, with digital, we open so many windows. But what you said, yes, it's also, I was considering, it would be hard to define your book because of that. It would be involving, as I was saying, philosophy would be just a part of it. There will be, of course, sociology and politics as in the real sense of it. But other things would be like, for example, historiography that you were mentioning, the broader idea of history and how is it created. You mentioned in one of your chapter, to go closer to the end of our discussion, how football and science, sometimes for a long time, they didn't appear in regular history. They were not considered subject of history, despite the huge influence they have on society and culture.
Yes. I mean, I'm talking about how what we know as official history of the world is actually a very dry history of political conquest, history of economy. And then we have this tremendously interesting history of science, history of art, history of entertainment, and they get their own categories. We learn about them separately. And I think that's a mistake. I think that we would understand ourselves and our world much better if all these things would be interconnected. Like, I find it funny how when we talk about cinema, when we talk about moving images, let's say, because my book, the subtitle of my book is a few thoughts and observations on preserving cinema. But if you read closely, you realize that I'm talking about much more than just cinema. I'm talking about moving images in general. And there's one area of moving images that absolutely fascinates me, and these are moving images connected with sports. I mean, who is preserving those? You know, there are much more people out there who live their lives in the sense that they become happy or sad, not because they see a good or a bad movie, but because their local football team won or lost. So in that sense, you know, football is just as the stuff that our dreams are made of, as theater and movies are. Who is preserving football? And then, you know, it's good that you mentioned it, because this is one of my favorite anecdotes in the book that I write about. I live in Austria now, so I studied the Austrian history of football, not only cinema. Maybe the Austrian history of football is even more interesting than the Austrian history of cinema. And I came across this fantastic figure of Matthias Sindelar or Schindler. He was an Austrian football player. He was called the Mozart of football. And all the football experts, including David Goldblatt, who wrote the book, The Ball is Round, they write of him as the best football player of the 20s and 30s. And they write of his style with such poetic terminology that you almost cry when you read these descriptions. And he is recorded on film. There's an Austrian film from 1938 by Josef von Fassari called Roxy and the Wonder Team, because the Wonder Team was the name of the Austrian team that played the World Cup in 1934. And that's all. We only have these few seconds of Matthias Sindelar. And then David Goldblatt says, maybe if we would have more recordings, these memories of Sindelar would be less poetic, less beautiful. So maybe it's okay that you know, we have lost
the legends,
moving images.
The legends.
Yeah, the legend is sometimes absolutely more beautiful. I mean, with all due respect, I'm not a terrible fan of The Other Side of the Wind by Orson Welles. I remember the emotions that were, you know, overcoming me when I was reading about this lost film for 10, 20, 30 years, and I was full of excitement, and then the film came out, and I kind of.
The other example exactly like that of movies that we were waiting to see, and then it took 10 years, so 20 years to make it. Then we watch and we're like, the idea was sometimes better and even more challenging to be considering, to be as film scholar, but in general as public, than the actual result of it. And yeah, sometimes it is what it is. We should but again, as you mentioned, that example particularly, it is on Sir Wells, so it is a very looking for. A lot of people look for it and waiting to. So there is attention. While with others, and of course with brother, and then we don't have the time to. But also you mentioned about West colonization, of course. So we extend the view on archiving and preservation to what is beyond, of course, Europe and North America. And that's what we were just talking briefly before. That is even more. So what kind of rights that let's say Western civilization is holding on some countries is even broader and even more complex in that sense, and archives too. And because cinema is definitely part of, as we said, industry, but also heritage.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I must say that I really, really appreciated your talk with Juan Sebastian before, because I will admit I know next to nothing about Latin American silent cinema. It was mesmerizing to listen to the talk. I can't wait to read the book. And yeah, we often, it's so easy, you know, to overlook, to forget, and create our own narratives with whatever is at our disposal.
So, Juri, thank you very much. This is the end of your presentation, of our presentation today's. I don't know if you have a last comment you want to add, or something very brief just for closing.
I would just like to thank you, Paolo, for all your wonderful questions. You mentioned that we are live and that people have the chance to, so if there's a question.
We haven't seen questions, but I'm sure they will come. They usually come later because we are live, but we will be repeated on our YouTube channel and then this will stay for long. So whatever we said will stay, at least for what YouTube permit us to. So considering I'm coming again. So thank you very much, Juri.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I just want to thank everybody as usual. We'll meet again tomorrow with other very interesting and different presentation. Thanks again, and goodbye from Pordenone. Arrivederci from Pordenone.